Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis. We're going to continue learning about American foreign policy after the Cold War. In our last lesson, we learned that after defeating communism, the United States decided it was going to be the world's police officer. Sometimes that went well, and sometimes it did not. But there's another huge piece of the story of American foreign policy in the last 30 years, the War on Terror. That is the story we're going to learn today. We'll start off by previewing our topics. Of course, we'll be talking about the attacks on September 11th. But that isn't the first terrorist attack in the United States. So we'll begin with the Oklahoma City bombing. We'll talk about Al-Qaeda and the war in Afghanistan. Then we'll talk about how the war on terror expanded into the Iraq War. We'll learn about surveillance, privacy, and security here at home and discuss the Patriot Act. And we're also going to talk about mass shootings and gun violence in America, which is a different sort of terror, but one that also affects us. Let's get started. Some Americans are afraid of our own government, especially after trust in the nation's leaders was ruined during the 1970s by the Watergate and other scandals. Those people had their fears confirmed in the spring of 1993, when federal and state police attacked the compound of a religious group which taught that the end of the world was coming soon. The group called themselves the Branch Davidians and lived near Waco, Texas. The police thought the Branch Davidians were breaking gun laws, and some of the members of the group had refused police orders. Police surrounded the building where the Branch Davidians lived for almost 2 months. The standoff was shown on television news every day. Finally, the police decided to attack the building and arrest the group's leaders. As police moved in, 76 men, women, and children died in a fire set by the Branch Davidians themselves. Many others killed themselves. During the 2 months leading up to the attack, some people who were afraid of the power of government came to support the Branch Davidians. One was Timothy McVeigh, a former Army soldier. McVeigh had served in Operation Desert Storm in Iraq, but after the war he stopped liking the Army when the Army Special Forces did not let him join. He thought that the Branch Davidians were victims of government terrorism. He and his friend Terry Nichols decided to take revenge. 2 years later, McVeigh parked a rented truck full of explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City and blew it up. More than 600 people were hurt in the attack and 168 died, including 19 children at a daycare center inside. Charles Porter IV, one of the workers in the building, won a Pulitzer Prize for the photo he took of a firefighter holding one of the children who died in the bombing. The photo showed the shock, horror, and sadness many Americans felt. McVeigh thought that bombing a government building would start a revolution, but it did not. He and Nichols were both arrested and put on trial. McVeigh was executed for the worst act of terrorism yet in America. Just a few months later, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, broke that dark record. Unlike the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma, September 11th attacks were carried out by foreigners. The group who planned the attacks was called Al-Qaeda. They were not new. In fact, they had already attacked Americans. Al-Qaeda was led by Osama bin Laden, a rich man from Saudi Arabia, who had gone to Afghanistan in the 1980s to fight against the Soviets. In bin Laden's mind, Muslims were being attacked by Christians from America and Europe. To be clear, almost no Muslims in the world liked bin Laden's extreme ideas. But he found a few people in the strict government of Afghanistan in the 1990s who helped him, and his group Al-Qaeda decided to attack Americans. In 1996, Al-Qaeda tried to kill United States President Bill Clinton while the president was visiting the Philippines, but the bomb they planted was discovered. In 1998, they bombed the U.S. embassies in the eastern African countries of Kenya and Tanzania, killing 224 people. In 2000, Al-Qaeda militants in Yemen bombed the ship USS Cole in a suicide attack. After the success of such a bold attack, Al-Qaeda's leaders got ready for an attack inside the United States. A few minutes after takeoff on the morning of September 11, 2001, teams of Al-Qaeda men took over 4 American airliners. 2 of the airplanes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. Morning news programs thought it had been an accident. Turning their cameras on the burning building, Americans watched as the second plane flew into the other tower. Less than 2 hours later, the heat from the crash and the burning jet fuel was too much, and both buildings crumbled and fell. Passengers and crew on both planes, as well as 2,606 people on the ground, died, including 343 New York City firefighters who had gone into the towers to save people. The third hijacked plane was flown into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the military just outside Washington, D.C., killing everyone on board and 125 people on the ground. The fourth plane, also flying towards Washington, crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, when passengers who had heard about the other planes tried to attack hijackers. Everyone on board was killed. That evening, President Bush promised Americans that the people who had planned the attacks would be found and would have to pay for what they did. 3 days later, Congress voted to give the president the power to use the military to find the group who had planned the attacks. Bush gave a speech and declared war on terrorism, blaming al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden for the attacks. In his speech, Bush described what we call the Bush Doctrine, the idea that the United States has the right to protect itself by starting wars to get rid of governments that might attack us or are helping people who attack us. Before September 11, 2001, most Americans had no idea where Afghanistan was and probably knew very little about it. But in reality, Afghanistan already had a connection to the United States. Back in the 1980s, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and the war there ended up being one of the many proxy wars of the Cold War. Since they were fighting against the Communist Soviet Union, both bin Laden and a group called the Taliban had gotten help from the United States. By the late 1980s, the Soviets and the Americans had both left Afghanistan, but not bin Laden. When the Soviets left, the Taliban took over the government of Afghanistan and ran it as a strict Islamic theocracy. They used the most extreme ideas about Islam to create laws. Many of their ideas seemed over the top to Americans, like not letting girls go to school or even leave their homes without a man or a boy to go with them. President George W. Bush told the Taliban to turn over bin Laden and the other members of al-Qaeda. When they said no, he ordered the American military into Afghanistan. By November of 2001, only 2 months after the 9/11 attacks, the Taliban had been thrown out of power and the United States started working to set up a new government for Afghanistan. However, Osama bin Laden and his followers escaped across the border to Pakistan, where they stayed hidden for many years. At the same time that the military was taking over Afghanistan, President Bush and his team were looking to a new and larger war with Iraq. The United States and Iraq had been enemies for many years, ever since the Gulf War in 1991. One group of George W. Bush's advisors, sometimes called neoconservatives or neocons, thought that Iraq and its dictator Saddam Hussein were setting a bad example for terrorist groups around the world. Among these was Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. They thought it was the right time to attack Iraq and get rid of Hussein once and for all. Others, like Secretary of State Colin Powell, were not sure starting a war was a good idea. After all, Iraq had not attacked the United States. President Bush himself had said that Iraq was one of America's greatest enemies in a speech in 2002, when he called Iraq, Iran, and North Korea an axis of evil. Using both a name for America's enemies of World War II and Reagan's famous name for the Soviet Union, the axis of evil sounded good, and Bush used it again and again as a simple way of talking about America's enemies. Attacking Iraq was a hard decision for many people in the United States. On one hand, no one thought that Saddam Hussein was a good person, and it was clear that he had done terrible things to both his own people and his neighbors. On the other hand, he had not attacked America, and he had not supported terrorists. Many wondered if it was legal or moral to attack first. Neoconservatives, who thought that attacking was right, won the argument. They said that Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. WMDs are nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons that can kill thousands of people at once. And the neocons said Hussein might use them against Israel. Hussein had used chemical weapons during a war with Iran in the 1980s and against the Kurds, an ethnic group who fought against his government in 1998. So many Americans thought it made sense that he might be willing to use them again. Following the Gulf War, inspectors from the United Nations had found and gotten rid of Iraqi WMDs. Now Bush's team said they thought Saddam Hussein had been able to hide nuclear weapons. President Bush told Americans that the United States could not wait until Hussein used the nuclear weapon to be sure he had them. The head of the United Nations team that had looked for nuclear weapons in Iraq said Bush's team was wrong. He said that Saddam Hussein had not been honest, but that he did not have WMDs. In the end, even Secretary of State Colin Powell told the United Nations General Assembly that Hussein had broken UN rules and was secretly hiding WMDs. A lot of the evidence the Americans used when telling the world about WMDs in Iraq had come from a spy, and it turned out later that the spy's information was fake. In March of 2003, the United States led an attack on Iraq with the help of Great Britain, Australia, and Poland. Another reason the neocons said it was the right time to attack Iraq was because they thought it would be easy. They remembered the short and successful first Gulf War. The reality, however, was more complicated. Few Americans died fighting the Iraqi army, but thousands of Iraqis were killed. Even those Iraqis who didn't like Saddam Hussein didn't like the idea of Americans attacking their homeland and killing their friends and family. Getting rid of Saddam Hussein and his government led to other problems the Americans had not planned on. Iraq is a large country with many different groups of people. When he was president, Hussein had ruled as a dictator and kept all those people from fighting. Without him, they all began trying to get control. In a speech in May 2003 on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, President Bush said that America had won the war. The banner that said "Mission Accomplished" was hanging on the ship behind him. But it turned out that the speech and the banner were both wrong. Bush and his team had not planned on a long war. They had also not planned on how to keep order in Iraq once they got rid of Hussein's police officers. And worst of all, they had not planned on how to deal with the fighting that began between the different groups who all wanted to be in charge. Americans remembered Bush's speech and the banner as a sign that he and his team had made a mistake by attacking Iraq, because most of the deaths and the fighting came after the speech. Right after the 9/11 attacks, Americans had looked to Bush for leadership. More than 90% of Americans liked the way he was doing his job. Even after the first few months of the Iraq War, 70% said they liked him. But as the country got ready for the 2004 election, people started to think the war in Iraq was a bad idea. News stories about more and more fighting, and the fact that no one had ever found WMDs, hurt Bush's popularity. Some people wondered if the president and his team had been lying about WMDs as an excuse to go to war. If he hadn't been lying, they wondered, how could he have been so wrong? Things got worse for Bush as people around the world started to complain about the way Americans were treating prisoners at the Guantanamo Bay prison. American leaders did not want to bring captured terrorists from Afghanistan to the United States because they would have to follow American law and let the terrorists have lawyers and a trial. They also didn't want to leave the terrorists in Afghanistan or Iraq, where local leaders might let them go. Instead, 779 prisoners were taken to the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, the last bit of land on Cuba the United States owned. Many people in the United States and around the world thought that Bush was using a trick to get out of following the law. It got worse when people found out that the prisoners were being tortured. For Americans who'd been tortured as prisoners in Vietnam, including Senator John McCain, finding out that their own country was doing the same terrible thing came as a shock and disappointment. When Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he promised to end the practice and close the prison at Guantanamo Bay. Although torture did stop, the prison stayed open. As of January 2001, 40 prisoners were still held there. Probably the worst moment of the war for many Americans was when photographs were released showing the torture of Iraqis by American soldiers at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Just as the United States had lost respect after the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, people around the world stopped believing that America was fighting for freedom and justice in the war on terror. In March 2004, fighters in Iraq attacked a group of truck drivers, driven by Americans working for the company Blackwater USA. The army had hired Blackwater to help them, and even though they weren't soldiers, these Americans were also targets of Iraqis who wanted the Americans out. Americans were shocked to learn that the Blackwater drivers had been tortured and killed. Attacks on Americans were one problem in Iraq, but attacks by one group of Iraqis on other groups of Iraqis was another, and there didn't seem like anyone had a good answer for that problem. Also, the American war in Iraq was starting to cost a lot of money that wasn't being spent fighting al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, where we still hadn't found Osama bin Laden. As the United States and the United Kingdom tried to end the fighting in Iraq and start up a new government, fighters from other countries in the Middle East started to arrive to help in the fight to get the Americans and British out. As the insurgency, or war against the Americans, grew, there was a change. No longer were Americans and British troops being attacked. The insurgents started attacking the new Iraqi army the Americans had been training, and hundreds of police officers and regular Iraqis were killed in bombings. For America, Iraq was turning out a lot like Vietnam. Soldiers were looking for enemy fighters who looked like regular people. Americans back home got mad when they read about our soldiers dying in battles to clear insurgents from the same towns over and over again. Any hope that the insurgency wouldn't last long and American soldiers would be able to come home ended as suicide bombers attacked all over Iraq. To fight back against the growing problem, President Bush asked for a surge of 21,500 more soldiers, money to give jobs to Iraqis, and $1.2 billion to rebuild the country. He hoped that by making Iraq safer and rebuilding the country would win the hearts and minds of the people. It got even more important for the United States to get things right in Iraq when the United Kingdom brought its soldiers home. The war had become so unpopular there that British leaders just quit and left the job to the United States. When he became president in 2009, President Obama said American soldiers would leave Iraq and the Iraqi army would take over the job of protecting the country. In December 2011, the last American soldiers came home, leaving only a small group of Americans to train the Iraqi army. In the summer of 2014, President Obama sent some American soldiers back to Iraq, but a relatively small group, to stop a new terrorist organization called the Islamic State, or ISIS. The civil war between ISIS and the government of Iraq went on for the next 3 years until ISIS was defeated near the end of 2017. Today, Iraq is mostly peaceful, and the Iraqi government has asked all foreign soldiers to leave their country. President Obama also kept his promise to find terrorists in Afghanistan. Like Bush had done in Iraq, Obama sent a surge of troops into Afghanistan. Their goal was to stop the Taliban, who had come back, who were trying to get rid of the government of Afghanistan that America supported. One thing that Americans all still wanted to do in Afghanistan was to find Osama bin Laden, the man who had planned the September 11th attacks. After 2002, he had escaped into the mountains. Finally, in 2011, spy agencies found him hiding in a house in Pakistan. In April 2011, President Obama ordered a secret operation to kill or capture him. On May 2nd, the President told the country that Navy SEALs had been able to fly into Pakistan without being discovered, kill bin Laden, and had buried his body at sea. A full 3 years later, and 5 years after Obama became president, there were still over 8,000 American soldiers in Afghanistan to help fight terrorists and train the Afghan army. When he was president, Donald Trump brought more of the soldiers home, but still left some in the country, hoping to stop the Taliban from retaking control. Finally, President Biden said that all American soldiers would leave Afghanistan by September 11, 2021, the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attack that led America into Afghanistan in the first place. It is the longest war in American history by far. The years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan have not done much to make America better. In Iraq, 4,475 American soldiers died, 32,220 were hurt. In Afghanistan, as of 2021, 2,420 soldiers died, and 19,950 were hurt. As many as 2 million people in Iraq and Afghanistan have died. It's hard to count up how much the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost, but could be as much as $4 trillion. Instead of raising taxes to pay for the wars, the government borrowed money. It would be many years before Americans have paid enough taxes to finish paying off the bills. September 11th made many Americans realize that the end of the Cold War did not mean an end to danger. Just like the Red Scare of the 1950s, some Americans worried that there might already be terrorists inside the United States. There was a rise in hate crimes against Muslim Americans. To make Americans safer, and to make them feel safer, the government created the Department of Homeland Security. This new department took control of the Coast Guard, the FBI, the Border Patrol, and other government agencies which help keep the country safe. What most Americans noticed about these changes was the new Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, that took over security at airports. Gone are the days when anyone could go through airport security and meet their friends at the gate. The government also passed the USA Patriot Act, which gave the police more power to find terrorists and stop attacks before they happen. For some, the Patriot Act took too much privacy away. For example, the law gave the police the right to monitor people's emails and phone calls without a warrant. Beginning in 2002, the National Security Agency, or NSA, started collecting the phone records of all Americans. The program ended when people leaked what the government was doing to the New York Times and was printed in the newspaper. The war on terror brought back the old fight between the government, which wants to do things secretly, and the people who want to know what their government is doing. In 2013, a government worker named Edward Snowden stole secret documents and gave them to the press. In June 2013, the first of Snowden's documents were published by the Washington Post and the Guardian newspaper in London. Later, other newspapers also published some of what Snowden had taken. When Americans read these documents, they learned about secret treaties the government made with other countries to share information about their people. What Snowden did reminded many people of the Pentagon Papers, which had shown government secrecy and lies about the Vietnam War. For the government, Snowden was dangerous. In court, the government accused Snowden of being a spy and stealing from the government. He moved to Russia to escape the American police. For people who think the government should have the power to find terrorists, Snowden is a traitor. On the other hand, people who think the government has taken too much power think Snowden is a hero for uncovering secrets and lies. We're going to shift topics a bit here, away from the idea of terrorist groups who attack Americans, to a new danger: individuals who engage in mass shootings. Before the 1990s, there were only a few mass shootings each year. But then in 1999, 2 students at Columbine High School in Colorado killed 17 people at their school. Since then, shootings have happened more and more. In the past 10 years, there have been multiple mass shootings each year, not only at schools, but also at businesses, theaters, nightclubs, military bases, and churches. The worst school shootings were in 2007, Virginia Tech, when 33 people were killed, and at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012, when 28 people were killed. The most people died in one attack in 2017 at a concert in Las Vegas, when 61 people were murdered. 849 more were hurt. The second most deadly shooting was in 2016 at the Orlando nightclub, when 50 people were killed. Mass shootings get a lot of attention in the news, but they're only a small fraction of all gun-related deaths in the United States. In 2018, 39,740 people were killed by guns. Of these deaths, 61% were suicides. 13,958 homicides, and over 1,000 deaths were caused by accidents or carelessness. Also, another 115,000 people were hurt, but not killed. America is different from most other countries in the world in this way. In a report from 2016 that compared the United States to 22 other rich countries, Americans had 25 times more deaths from guns than any other country. The United States had 82% of all gun deaths, even though the other countries had twice as many people. In 2020, a report found that 44% of Americans live in a home with guns. And in the United States, there are more guns than people. Gun violence is most common in poor areas of cities, but people own guns in all parts of the country. Of course, many people have tried to stop gun violence. Lately, people have tried to make new laws and make it harder for people to buy guns or make it illegal to get some kinds of guns. But guns have a special place in America's history that goes back all the way to when America was born. Because Americans had guns in the 1770s, they were able to fight against the British. Eventually, an army made up of regular people defeated the powerful British Army, and the United States became independent. The founding fathers who wrote our new country's Constitution knew that the government could never take too much power if people had guns. So they added the Second Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment said that the people have the right to own guns. The Second Amendment says, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." For most of America's history, people didn't really think much about the Second Amendment. Americans were farmers and explorers, and almost everyone at least had one gun. But now, most people live in cities, and as crime has gone up, Americans have started thinking more about what the Second Amendment says. Today, gun politics is broken down into two ways of thinking. One group of people like the idea of gun control. They want there to be laws that limit guns and limit who can buy guns. These people look at the first half of the Second Amendment, where it says that people have the right to own guns, so they can be part of a well-regulated militia. For these people, the amendment clearly gives a reason for having guns. On the other hand, people who like gun rights point to the second half of the amendment to show that the government has no power to limit guns. In other nations, where the right to own guns is not written into the Constitution, mass shootings have led to quick changes in the law. After a mass shooting at a church in New Zealand, that country's government passed a new law that made military-style guns illegal. In Australia, a mass shooting led to a law that made almost all guns illegal. In the United Kingdom, guns are so rare that even police officers don't carry guns. In the United States today, the National Rifle Association, or NRA, is a powerful protector of gun rights. They're an interest group that gives a lot of money to political candidates and tries to change how people think about guns. The NRA started this work when the conservative revolution happened in the 1970s, and they mostly helped the Republican Party. Most Republicans support gun rights, and the NRA has given a lot of money to Republican politicians. After the shooting in 2018 at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, student survivors formed a group to fight for new laws to limit gun ownership. Many of the students blamed the NRA and the politicians who accept money from them for stopping new gun laws. The NRA defended gun owners and blamed the shooting on the FBI and the media. The NRA also said that the shooting proved that more guns were needed in schools, in the hands of security guards and teachers, to stop shooters. Florida law passed after the shooting that stopped people under 21 from buying guns was challenged in court by the NRA, who said that it discriminated against 18 to 21-year-olds. From what we've seen in the past 20 years, both the danger of guns and the debate over guns seems to be part of America's future. That concludes today's difficult lesson. We'll finish up by recapping the key ideas. September 11th attacks were the start of what we call the War on Terror. This included hunting for the Al-Qaeda terrorists and other potentially dangerous groups. President Bush also convinced Americans to invade Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq did not turn out well. In both countries, the United States had a hard time rebuilding the country, stopping insurgents and building up stable governments, police, and militaries. Americans tortured prisoners in Iraq and the detention of terror suspects in Guantanamo Bay. This hurt America's reputation in the world. In order to find terrorists and stop their attacks, Congress passed laws giving the government the power to watch American citizens. Eventually, some of this power was taken away as people learned how much privacy they were giving up in the name of security. In recent years, mass shootings have come to be a new sort of terror. Students are an important anti-gun group, while the NRA serves as a well-funded pro-gun lobby. The Second Amendment guarantees America's right to own guns, which makes gun regulation less likely in the United States than in other countries. Thank you very much. We certainly live in challenging times, but I, for one, have hope that your generation will be able to find creative ways to solve some of these problems. See you next time.